These are 7 blood pressure myths that keep you on drugs forever. Now, nobody ever wants to be on blood pressure medication, especially for the rest of their life, but many people are. And so I'm going to cover 7 things that you're probably being told by someone who's well-meaning and are not actually true. The first myth is that once you're on blood pressure medication, you're on it for the rest of your life, that you cannot get on it. This is not true. However, for many people, it's reality, and there's a difference. The reason I say it's not true is because any disease process, if you were to get rid of the disease, then you simply wouldn't need the medication anymore. Almost in all diseases, if you have, let's say, the flu, or you have a bacterial infection, they give you antibiotics. It doesn't mean that you're going to be on antibiotics for the rest of your life. Once the disease is gone from your body, you simply don't need that antibiotic anymore. That should make sense to people. Let's do another example. Let's do diabetes, type 2, not type 1. But if you were to change your lifestyle and cure yourself of type 2 diabetes, if you can get to it soon enough, then you wouldn't need medication for the diabetes anymore. Well, why is blood pressure any different? If someone walks into a doctor's office as an extremely unhealthy and is diagnosed with high blood pressure, who's to say that if you were to change the way you do things, and actually maybe it takes a year, maybe 2 years, who knows, but you change your life and now you're really healthy and you don't have high blood pressure, why would you stay on blood pressure medication? So this idea that once you're on it for the rest of your life only is true if you never try to cure the disease yourself. And so that is a terrible myth. Number 2, my blood pressure is 140/90. When people say that, they're acting as if that their blood pressure is always 140/90. It's almost like your age. If someone says, I'm 56 years old, you're 56 years old for an entire year, at least you're allowed to say that. The blood pressure numbers fluctuate. And one of the misconceptions is that when you go to a doctor's office, whatever your blood pressure is, it is only your blood pressure at that particular moment. There are numerous examples and reasons why your blood pressure might be higher at the doctor's office than it is normally throughout the day or at home. And I have a video that discusses the 11 mistakes that most doctors make and most people make in checking their own blood pressure. I'll save that to the end, okay? But the truth of the matter is that your blood pressure probably fluctuates throughout the day. And under periods of high stress, going to the doctor's office, your blood pressure may be higher than it really is during the day. A good clue that this is true is that if you're diagnosed with high blood pressure, given medications, and then those medications have terrible side effects, like you're dizzy all the time, you feel faint, you have no energy, maybe you're falling because your blood pressure is lower even than it really should be, then that's a clue that the 140/90, the number that you were given, is not super accurate. So blood pressure numbers fluctuate throughout the day. It's not one number that you get to keep. The third myth is that diet does not alter your blood pressure. I don't know how else to explain it other than your diet plays a major role in your blood pressure. Many people change their diet after being diagnosed with high blood pressure and actually improve their blood pressure. And it almost doesn't matter what diet you change to, because for many people, it's the weight loss, the strain on the heart, that affects the blood pressure. So let's say a person's 330 pounds and goes on a carnivore diet. Let's say they lose 100 pounds. Their blood pressure goes down. It's not always because of the fact that all they ate was meat. It's the fact they lost 100 pounds. Likewise, a person can do the exact opposite and go on a totally different diet. Let's say a vegetarian diet or a Mediterranean diet or a DASH diet or a zone diet. You get the picture. Keto diet, gotta throw that in. And they lose 100 pounds. Their blood pressure is gonna go down as well. There's some other things that some people will have food sensitivities, where some people will eat a certain food and they'll react negatively to it. So clearly they should eliminate those foods. But ultimately, diet is a major contributor to high blood pressure. And it's just ridiculous to think that your diet has no bearing on your blood pressure. I think the reason this myth does exist is because many doctors don't feel as though people will change their diet. Because quite frankly, it's difficult to change your diet. So when doctors see you, they just assume that if you were going to change your diet, you would have changed it by now. And so that's where I think this myth keeps being told. Because I have tons of patients that tell me that, first of all, their doctor never even spoke to them about their diet. Second, when the patient asked, well, what about changing my diet? A lot of doctors just say, it's not going to work. The fourth myth is the myth of genetics. Now, this is partly true because some people run higher than other people, and it's genetic, but they're often fine. Disease levels of genetics is really what we're talking about. People are not genetically made to have blood pressure in the systolic number above 200 and the diastolic number to be over 110. So when a person's got a blood pressure that is, let's say, 210 over 110, and they say, well, it's just genetic, a component of it might be, but most of the time, that person has lifestyle choices that are contributing to their high blood pressure. The highest blood pressure that I have ever witnessed myself was the systolic was like 280 millimeters of mercury, and the diastolic was in the 130s. I'm across the street from a hospital and sent the patient to that hospital. Now this patient, and this was years ago, but this patient was a Vietnam vet. He had no teeth because he lost all his teeth. He was upwards of 300 and something pounds, because after 300 pounds, you just don't ask anymore. He smoked cigarettes. He had every risk factor possible. And he drank alcohol. So, I mean, you know, it was pretty bad. So when I saw that blood pressure, I did not want him in my office anymore. That's more of a medical emergency. But some people will have a genetically higher blood pressure. They tend to run high, let's say 135, 140, over 85. And while those are numbers that would be considered high enough to medicate, those are normal numbers for that person. And if their lifestyle is such that they're actually very healthy and don't have any other cardiovascular risks, then when you give people these medications to force their blood pressure down to below 120 over 80, very often you make them sick, you make them ill. You get all the classic symptoms of low blood pressure: fainting, feeling dizzy, not feeling well, fatigue, tiredness, all these things. So some people, while their blood pressure is high, considering the standards by which we judge blood pressure now, they really aren't that high, especially if their risk factors are such that they're actually healthy people. They just happen to run high. And most of these people, you know, their mother has higher blood pressure, their father has higher blood pressure, yet their mother and father have lived to be 99 years old. Their grandparents had high blood pressure and they lived to be in their 90s. When you see a patient like that, you're less inclined to give them medication. But genetics can play a role in higher blood pressure, but not high disease states, higher blood pressure. The fifth myth is that everyone gets higher blood pressure. And it's a myth, but it's somewhat true. Statistically, as you get older, more and more people will have higher blood pressure than when they're younger. So when you look at the age brackets, who has normal blood pressure? Young people. Who has higher blood pressure? Older people. It's only because they've been on the earth long enough and been on the earth long enough to eat enough bad food so that they can accumulate higher blood pressure. Our arteries are not supposed to be as pliable when you're 90 as they were when you were 10. So there should be an allowable amount of number range to allow for higher blood pressure. In fact, some people believe that as you get older, your blood pressure should be a little bit higher. The standards of today say that everyone should have pretty much the same blood pressure from cradle to grave. And I think most doctors that are reasonable think that this is a ridiculous recommendation and will allow older patients to have higher blood pressure. But the fact that everyone gets on blood pressure medication, so thus it's normal, is a ridiculous myth. Which brings us to the sixth myth, and that is 119/79 is normal, and anything above that is now considered elevated blood pressure. Sure, these are the guidelines, and some people believe that the pharmaceutical companies did research to try to prove this so that they could sell more drugs. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I'm not here to make that argument right now. You can let me know in the comments what you think. However, they have found that the lower the blood pressure, the less risk there is for heart attacks and strokes. And when they come up with guidelines, which they did some years ago, they found that people that had below 120/80 had less risk of heart attacks and strokes than they did 140/90, which was the old number where they decided to call it high blood pressure. So 119/79 is pretty darn low. And when you medicate people to try to force that number to exist in their body, very often people get sick. And so the challenge is, if you're doing treatment on someone and you're making them unwell, is that really worth it? And the answer for some people is no. And that's why just having one number as the criteria, as 119/79, and anything above that is now entering a disease state, who's to say that 121/81 is so much worse than 179? So there's a lot of gray area that should be allowed in these recommendations that just isn't when you look at the guidelines. The seventh and final myth is that salt causes high blood pressure. The answer is, it's not really, but it kind of is. And what they mean when they say salt is the cause of high blood pressure is that in some individuals, salty foods contributes to their higher blood pressure. In other words, they are sensitive to salt. Not everybody is sensitive to salt. And most people, when they think of salt, they think of the salt shaker. They think of the actual salting of the foods. But that's not what we mean when we're talking about salt. We're talking about the McDonald's French fries, the Wendy's French fries, the hamburgers, the fried foods, all the potato chips and snacks that we eat that have salt in them. Most people get way too much salt. In America, we eat probably two to three times as much salt as we actually need to be healthy. When we say salt doesn't matter, what we mean is salting the food doesn't matter. Because when you use the salt shaker, that's a very small portion of the amount of salt that you're getting. So for example, in the DASH diet, you try to eat foods that are not salty. And by reducing the amount of salt that you eat, by cutting it either in half or literally reducing your salt intake by 70% by not eating salty foods, the salt shaker really doesn't matter at that point. The salt shaker is more to accentuate taste of food rather than your actual salt intake. But some people are very sensitive to salt. Others, salt doesn't make any difference. So it really depends on the individual person. Now, I mentioned that checking blood pressure can be a problem, and many people make mistakes when they're checking blood pressure. So if you want to know what your blood pressure is, you have to do it in a very specific way, a very standardized way, to make sure that you're getting accurate information. And there are 11 mistakes. There's actually more than that, but I made a video about 11 mistakes, and there's a follow-up video after that. But watch this video right now here on this right side of the the page, and make sure and watch that, because you want to make sure you know what your blood pressure really is so you get an accurate assessment.